There are things I know about myself that took years to learn, and one of them is this. I have never been the kind of woman who cries where anyone can see her. Not because I'm cold, not because I don't feel things down to the marrow, but because I learned early that visible vulnerability is a resource other people will extract from you. You cry in front of the wrong person and they file it away. They remember the shape of your breaking point, and when they need leverage, they press exactly there. My parents taught me that lesson, though I don't think they meant to. I am Maya Okonkwo, 29 years old, born on a January morning so cold the Ottawa General Hospital's windows were frosted over from the inside. I know this because my Uncle James told me the story once. Leaning back in his kitchen chair in his Toronto apartment, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea, a smile on his face that had something tender in it. "You came into this world fighting," he said. "The heat wasn't working properly on that floor. Nurses were grumbling. Your mother was furious. And you just arrived, already annoyed. I have spent my entire adult life arriving, already annoyed, already prepared. Here is who I am, in the life I actually live. I am a corporate immigration lawyer at Richter & Associates, one of the most respected firms operating between Toronto and Ottawa. I have been practicing for 6 years. My annual salary is $190,000, and I earn every cent of it across 60-hour weeks that leave me wired and satisfied in a way I couldn't have imagined when I was working 3 part-time jobs to get through McGill. 3 years ago, I bought a condominium in downtown Ottawa for $680,000. I paid cash. Not because I'm reckless with money, but because I'd spent a decade being meticulous with it. And I'd reached the point where owning something outright felt like a fundamental human need. No landlord, no bank. Mine. The condo has floor-to-ceiling windows on the east side that look out over the Rideau Canal. In winter, when they flood it and freeze it and open it for skating, I can stand at those windows with coffee and watch the city exist in a way that still strikes me as almost unbearably beautiful. Ottawa is like that. People underestimate it. They think it's just the government, just the bureaucracy, just the gray institution of a capital that isn't quite as dramatic as the country it represents. But they haven't seen the Byward Market on a Saturday morning in October, produce stalls gleaming with the last of the fall harvest, the old stone buildings sitting solid and patient behind all the noise. They haven't walked the glebe at night, the Victorian houses lit from within, the smell of someone's fireplace drifting out into a street quiet enough to hear your own thinking. I love this city. I built my life in it deliberately, brick by brick, and the life I built is good. My husband David is British, software engineer. Brilliant in the specific way that people who understand systems are brilliant, which is to say he sees the logic underneath everything, the structure that holds the visible world together, and he is never frightened by complexity. He has dark hair that needs cutting approximately 3 weeks before he thinks it does, and a laugh that comes from somewhere genuine, and he collects terrible art. Not ironically terrible, which might have been charming. Just genuinely bad paintings he finds at estate sales and markets, which he hangs with complete sincerity and defends with elaborate passion if you question them. I love him for this. I love him for 100 things, but this one specifically, he has no pretension. He likes what he likes, and he does not apologize for it. We met at a professional conference in Toronto in the spring of 2022. He was there because his firm was navigating a complex work permit situation for some of their international staff, and someone had suggested he attend a panel on corporate immigration pathways. I was there because I was speaking on that panel. We argued afterward over coffee about a technical point I'd made regarding reciprocity agreements. And he was wrong. And he knew he was wrong but kept arguing anyway because he was interested in the conversation, not the victory. I found that extraordinarily attractive. We exchanged cards. He emailed the next morning. We were together by summer. He didn't marry me for status. He married me despite my warning him very clearly, very early, about my family. That warning conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in late summer, sitting on the patio of a restaurant in the Glebe, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and good wine and a chalkboard menu that changes weekly. We had been together 3 months. He had mentioned his parents twice in casual conversation, both times with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who does not have to think about whether to mention them. I noticed this. I notice everything about how people talk about their families, the way a person trained to read documents notices the information between the lines. I set down my wine. I said, "Before this goes further, there are things about my family you need to understand." He looked at me with the particular attentiveness he has, direct, unhurried, like someone who has turned off the part of themselves that is composing the next sentence and is simply receiving. I told him about my mother's philosophy, the nothing is owed position, the way my childhood had been structured like an audited account, every kindness a line item, every expectation a potential default. I told him about the dental work I waited too long for, about the call when I got into law school, about the performance they wanted from me my whole life, not the genuine performance of a daughter finding her way, but the specific theatrical production in which I played a character they could claim credit for, successful enough to reflect well, struggling enough to need direction. I was watching his face while I talked, looking for what I always look for in new people, the flinch. The slight recalibration that happens when someone realizes the family they are being introduced to is more complicated than the brochure suggested. The mental arithmetic of whether the complication is worth the cost. David did not flinch. He listened all the way to the end, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Are they capable of change, do you think? Not what do you want to do about them? Not have you thought about cutting them off?" He asked whether they were capable of change, which was the precise question I had been sitting with for years without having the language for. "I don't know," I said. "I've never had enough information to know." He nodded slowly, as if this made complete sense. "Then you need the information," he said, "before you can decide anything else." I thought about that for a very long time afterward. The clarity of it. The practical acceptance of uncertainty as a starting condition. He did not try to solve the problem. He just identified what I needed to solve it myself. That is the person I married. Now here is the other life. The one I perform every Sunday morning with the precision of a stage actor who has rehearsed the same show so many times the lines live in the body instead of the mind. In that life, I am Maya Okonkwo, desperate immigrant wife. I live in a cramped basement apartment on Bank Street, a friend's place, borrowed for the specific purpose of Sunday video calls, the lighting arranged to emphasize the low ceilings and the slightly damp smell that seeps in from the walls when Ottawa's freeze-thaw cycle does its seasonal damage. I work part-time at Tim Hortons. The uniform was purchased online. Worn twice for photographs to establish the story, never in an actual Tim Hortons because I drink my coffee from the $400 espresso machine I bought myself years ago and have never once mentioned to my parents. In that life, my husband David is an immigrant with uncertain status, a man whose work permit situation is precarious, whose entire Canadian future depends on paperwork moving through channels slowly, grinding against bureaucratic machinery that could stop at any moment and send him away. In that life, I need my parents. What those calls actually felt like from the inside is difficult to describe to someone who has never had to perform inside an intimate relationship. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from effort but from sustained compression, the work of holding your actual self in a container slightly too small for it while projecting a different self outward. Actors talk about this sometimes. The metabolic cost of inhabiting someone else's life for extended periods. I am not an actor, but I am a lawyer. And a lawyer learns early that performance is part of the work, that the self you present in a courtroom or an interview room is shaped and deliberate, that the gap between your internal experience and your external presentation is something you manage, actively, the way you manage a difficult witness. Managing my parents on those calls was technically the most demanding work of my life. And I say that having argued contested immigration cases before the Federal Court of Appeal. On those Sunday calls, I sat in the Bank Street apartment with the low ceiling and the slightly damp smell, wearing the kind of clothes I'd purchased specifically because they looked like the clothes of someone who shopped based on necessity rather than preference. And I let my voice carry something tired and strained that was not entirely performance. Because underneath the architecture of the experiment, underneath the evidence I was collecting and the hypothesis I was testing, there was something real that I'd stopped fully acknowledging. I was tired. I had been tired for a long time, not of the experiment, of needing to run it at all, of being a person who had to construct a laboratory out of her own family in order to answer a question that should have had a visible, obvious answer from the beginning. My mother's voice on those calls had a quality I'd never heard before. A warmth that was not quite warmth, more the temperature of attention. She asked questions. She engaged. She followed up on things I'd mentioned the previous week, which meant she was actually listening and retaining, which was new. I registered this carefully, without letting it move me too quickly, because I knew, intellectually, professionally, with the certainty of someone who has reviewed thousands of documents that tell a different story than the one being performed, that attention is not the same as love. Interest is not the same as love. Someone can be invested in your story without being invested in you. I cataloged every call. I had a document on my home computer, password protected, titled simply Sundays, in which I recorded the substance of each conversation. What questions were asked, what information was offered, what the tone suggested about the underlying motivation. I reviewed it sometimes late at night, David already asleep, the city quiet outside the east windows, the canal visible in the dark below. I reviewed it looking for evidence of the thing I still, despite everything, wanted to find. I didn't find it. But I did find the shape of its absence, which is its own kind of information. You might want to stop me here and ask why. Why would someone with my education, my income, my fundamental independence, why would she spend 2 years performing helplessness for the benefit of the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally? The answer is this. Because I needed to know whether conditional love was the only kind they had. And I needed evidence, not impressions. I am a lawyer. I deal in evidence. The first clue came when I was 19. Home from my first year at McGill, which I was funding through a patchwork of scholarships, bursaries, and 3 part-time jobs that left me sleeping 6 hours a night and still loving it. Still feeling the expanding universe sensation of learning things that cracked the world open a little wider every week. A friend of mine from high school, Priya, had mentioned that her parents were helping her buy a used car so she wouldn't have to take 2 buses to her summer internship. I mentioned this to my mother in passing. The way you mention things to parents when you still believe they're interested in the texture of your daily life. My mother set down the dish she was drying. She turned to me with an expression that I can still see clearly, all these years later. Not unkind exactly, but with a firmness to it that foreclosed argument before I'd opened my mouth. "We're not like these Canadian families," she said, and her accent thickened the way it always did when she was making a pronouncement she considered important. "We don't owe you anything just because we had you. You want something? Earn it yourself." I remember the quality of the silence that followed, the way the kitchen seemed to contract around that sentence. I remember thinking, with the clarity of someone whose assumptions have just been removed surgically, she means it. This isn't a tough love pose. She genuinely believes this is wisdom. That philosophy calcified over the years into something harder and more elaborate. They paid for nothing. Not tuition, not books, not residence, not the dental work I needed the summer between 2nd and 3rd year when I couldn't afford the dentist and waited 3 months too long. I graduated from McGill with honors and $47,000 of student loan debt that I carried into law school with me like a companion I'd grown grudgingly used to. When I called my parents to tell them I'd been accepted, my mother said, "Good." When I graduated law school and called to say I'd articled at a major firm, my father's response was so specific and so perfectly calibrated to deflate that I think about it sometimes the way you think about a song that got stuck. "Good," he said. "Now you won't ask us for money anymore." I never had, but this was not a moment for pointing that out. I want to be precise about something, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came next. I did not set out to punish them. The experiment I constructed was not designed with revenge as the outcome. What I wanted, what I told myself I wanted, was information. I wanted to know whether the version of my parents that existed when I was succeeding without their help was the same version that would exist when they believed I needed them. I wanted to know if love was in them somewhere, dormant, waiting for the right conditions to surface. I gave them what I thought were the right conditions. After David and I got together and I began introducing him, carefully, strategically, to my family, I told them the story I'd prepared. An immigrant. Talented, yes, but precarious. Work permit status uncertain. The kind of situation where everything could collapse if the paperwork didn't go right. I watched my parents' faces as I spoke. I watched the calculation happen. The mental arithmetic of what this meant, what this cost, what leverage it created. My mother's first question was not whether he was kind, not whether he made me happy, not whether I was safe or loved or seen. She asked, "What does his family have?" That question did something permanent to me. Not immediately. Grief is slow. It processes on its own schedule. But over the weeks that followed, I felt something shift in the architecture of my hope. I was still hoping, you understand? I hadn't given up, but I was beginning to understand the shape of what I was hoping for and how unlikely it was. I started performing poverty in earnest. The Bank Street apartment, the Tim Hortons job mentioned in Sunday calls, let to settle into the narrative without elaboration. The worried calls about visa applications, the anxiety in my voice carefully calibrated, not overdone because my mother knows overdone. She'd built a performance career herself. Just the right amount of strain, the right register of someone holding it together with effort. And here is what happened. They began to engage. Differently than before, but they engaged. My father started calling more. My mother stopped making excuses to end our conversations early. For a few weeks in the early months of the performance, I felt something very close to relief. I thought, this is it. This is what it took. Not my success, which they'd always been able to dismiss as expected, but my need, my visible, fragile need. Then I noticed the ledger. I should tell you about the Sunday dinner with the spreadsheet, because it reframed everything that came before it and made everything that came after it inevitable. I'd driven to Rockcliffe Park, the neighborhood where my parents had lived for 20 years, the grand old houses set back from streets lined with oak trees, the kind of neighborhood that announces its own security quietly, through restraint. And we were sitting at the dining room table with the remnants of the jollof rice my mother made for company. And my father pulled out his phone with the particular gesture of a man producing evidence. He tapped the screen twice, turned it toward me, a spreadsheet, color-coded, each entry dated, labeled, and totaled with the thoroughness of someone who'd built a professional life on precision. The $200 for what he'd called emergency rent in September, the $150 for David's fictional legal consultation fees, the $300 for immigration paperwork that didn't exist, 12 separate entries spanning 8 months, $8,750. "This is what we've invested in you," my father said, his finger moving to the total at the bottom. Not with cruelty. That's the thing that's hardest to explain. He was not being intentionally cruel. He was being instructive. He genuinely believed this was the appropriate way to frame a parent's financial assistance to an adult child, as an investment. Subject to terms, accruing interest. "We'll expect this back, with reasonable interest once David gets his status and you're both working properly." I looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. I looked at the careful columns, the dates, the amounts, the total. I thought about the fact that $8,750 was less than 3 weeks of my actual salary. I said, "Okay, Dad," and I picked up my fork and finished my rice. I drove home from Rockcliffe Park that evening through streets that were turning orange and bronze at the edges, autumn arriving in the measured way it arrives in Ottawa, without drama, just the gradual reddening of things. I turned onto the Queensway and let the muscle memory of the route take over while my mind sat with the spreadsheet. $8,750. In my actual life, the life I lived every other day of the week, not Sunday, I had recently sent a client a bill for $12,000 for 3 weeks of work on a complicated corporate immigration matter. My billing rate was $450 an hour. I thought about this on the drive home, not because money was the point, but because scale was the point. Because my father had sat across from me with a color-coded spreadsheet and spoken about it the way a man speaks about something significant, something weighty, a resource that represented sacrifice and investment and expectation, and the number was less than I sometimes earned in a week. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because the arithmetic revealed something important about the architecture of my parents' love. It was scaled to a version of me they had constructed and preserved, a daughter who existed in permanent relation to their resources, the daughter who needed what they had to give, the daughter for whom their particular currency was meaningful. They had never attempted to know the daughter I actually was, because that daughter didn't need anything from them, and a person who needs nothing from you is very difficult to keep at the center of a narrative about generosity and sacrifice and investment. When I walked into the condo that evening, David looked up from the couch. He read my face the way he always does, quickly, completely, without asking unnecessary questions. "Spreadsheet?" he said. "Spreadsheet," I confirmed. He got up and went to the kitchen and came back with 2 glasses of wine and sat beside me and waited. Not to process it together, not to offer perspective, not to fix it. Just to be there while I decided what I needed. This is a skill I have never quite figured out how he learned. This particular quality of presence without pressure. I suspect it's simply who he is, a person whose security doesn't require the people he loves to need him, which means he can offer them what they actually need, rather than what he needs to provide. "I'm starting to see the full shape of it," I said eventually. "Yeah? They don't love me less because I'm successful. They love me less because I'm not useful. Success without need is just an implicit criticism. It makes them feel irrelevant." David considered this. "That's probably the loneliest thing you've ever figured out," he said. It was. If the spreadsheet was the shape of my father's love made visible, then my mother's version of the same thing had a different texture. It was performative. She used my invented struggle as entertainment. I discovered this gradually, through the way certain conversations would end when I called during the week, the way I'd sometimes hear background voices that stopped when she realized I could hear them. I understood it fully only when she started inviting me to gatherings at the Hintonburg Community Center where she volunteered. Gatherings that put me in rooms with women from the same Nigerian-Canadian community networks my parents had built their social world in. "This is my daughter Maya," she would say, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who knows they have the room's sympathy. "She married for love, an immigrant boy with nothing. Very romantic, very foolish. A smile, a practiced small headshake. Now she works at Tim Hortons while her law degree collects dust." The women would look at me with expressions ranging from pity to faint contempt. Pity for my circumstances. Contempt for what my mother had framed as a spectacular failure of strategic thinking. I would smile and accept their sympathies and drive home afterward and sit in the parking garage of my actual building, in the leather seat of my car, and breathe through the feeling of it. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something more useful. The experiment was working. I was seeing exactly who they were. I needed to see a little more. The worst of it came 6 months before the interview, at a Sunday dinner that I agreed to attend because my Uncle James was visiting from Toronto. And I hadn't seen him in 4 months, and he is one of the people in my life who has always known which version of me is real. He knew about the experiment in broad strokes, not the details, but he knew I was watching and why. He didn't approve exactly. He thought it would hurt me more than it would help, but he understood. David came with me that day. This was rare. I usually kept him separate from my parents, both to protect him and to protect the experiment from variables I couldn't control. But that Sunday felt like a pressure point, a moment I needed a witness for. David had agreed. We'd talked about it the night before, sitting on our balcony with wine, the canal dark and still below us. "Let them show themselves completely," he'd said. "Whatever happens in there, we're collecting information, not wounds. Keep that in mind." He is remarkably good at maintaining perspective. My Uncle James was at the table when we arrived, and there was a warmth in the room that my parents' house rarely had. He brought it with him. That ease, that willingness to fill a space with genuine laughter. My cousin was on the phone from Lagos, her voice audible from the small speaker my aunt had brought. There was pepper soup and egusi and the particular combination of sound and smell that is, at its most elemental, home. Not home as I live it, but home as it exists in some older cellular memory. And then my mother did what she always does when she has an audience and a point to make. My uncle had been telling the story of my cousin Adiza's engagement to a doctor in Toronto, the ceremony being planned, the families already in negotiation about logistics and celebration. He told it with joy, with pride, with the uncomplicated pleasure of a man whose family is doing well. And my mother heard it the way she hears everything, as a comparison, as a bar. She waited for a pause in the story. She let the warmth in the room reach its peak. Then, "At least some daughters think about their families when they choose husbands." Her voice carried. It was designed to carry. She had calibrated it for exactly this effect. The dining room acoustics, the position of each person at the table, the moment in the conversation when the contrast would land hardest. Maya here married a charity case. I felt David's hand find mine under the table, warm, steady. He squeezed once, and I understood it. We agreed on this. Let them show themselves completely. We told her, my mother continued, addressing my uncle with the tone of someone presenting evidence to a sympathetic jury. Think about your future. Think about what you could bring to this family. But no, she chose struggle. She chose romance over reason. Now we have to support them both like their children. My uncle's expression had done something complicated. He was watching my mother with an attention that was not entirely comfortable to witness, the attention of a man who has been in this room before, metaphorically, who knows the texture of what's happening but has no language for interrupting it gracefully. My father added his piece. The money we're spending on her could have been our retirement fund. Instead, we're bankrolling her immigration mess. You marry a Canadian citizen properly, these problems don't exist. And then, this is the moment I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. The moment that sent me to the files. My uncle said, "You know what's funny about citizenship?" He said it lightly, conversationally, like the beginning of an observation that might land gently or might not land at all. My mother cut him off, not with words exactly, with a look and a subject change so swift and complete that the sentence was erased from the air before it could fully arrive. She asked my uncle about his flight from Toronto, whether the highway had been bad, whether he was hungry. The conversation pivoted. My uncle let it pivot. But his eyes found mine for just a moment across the table. And something in that look, some old knowledge passing between us, settled into me like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. I drove home that night, running the moment on a loop. My uncle's unfinished question. My mother's sharp redirect. You know what's funny about citizenship? What was funny about it? What would my uncle, who had known my parents for 30 years, find notable enough to mention? What was the observation that my mother needed to stop before it reached the table? I spent 2 days sitting with the question before I did what I should have done years earlier. I used the tools I actually had. I am an immigration lawyer. I have clearances. I have access to channels that most people don't know exist. I had never, in 6 years of practice, thought to pull my parents' immigration file. Why would I? I'd assumed their story was what every family story is when you grow up inside it. The background, the wallpaper, the thing so constant and ordinary that you stopped actually looking at it. Educated professionals from Nigeria, skilled worker category, legitimate application. 2 years before I was born, they became Canadian citizens, and I'd never questioned the mechanism of that becoming. It took me 3 days to obtain the complete file. I remember sitting at my desk in my home office. I work from home 2 days a week, a negotiated arrangement that gives me my best thinking hours without commute interference, with a cup of coffee going cold to my left, and the documents arranged before me. I remember the quality of the light through the east windows, winter light, clear and without warmth, the canal visible below in the middle distance. I started reading. Their marriage certificate showed a wedding date of March 3rd, 1992. I did the arithmetic in my head before I even reached the next page. My mother's student visa, according to the attached records, was set to expire March 17, 1992, 2 weeks later. My father was already a permanent resident. His skilled worker application had been approved 18 months earlier, clean and straightforward, the kind of application immigration officers process with minimal friction because everything is in order. He had status. He had stability. My mother had 2 weeks. I turned to the interview notes. The officer who had conducted their legitimacy assessment had been thorough in a way that suggested either conscientiousness or skepticism, possibly both. The notes read with the careful neutrality of official documentation, but the substance was clear. Couple demonstrates limited knowledge of each other's backgrounds, contradictory statements about courtship timeline, applicant unable to identify spouse's professional training institution, sponsor uncertain of applicant's home state. They had barely known each other. The following sentence. However, applicant is pregnant, 8 weeks confirmed, which establishes ongoing relationship. Application approved. I read that twice, then a third time. They had used pregnancy to authenticate a marriage of convenience. They had used me, 8 weeks of me, a cluster of cells that would become the person sitting at this desk 30 years later reading this document, as evidence, as proof, as the detail that tipped the scale from suspicious to plausible. I was the insurance policy. I set the papers down and looked out the window for a long time. The canal, the skaters in the distance, small and bright against the white. I waited for what I was feeling to announce itself clearly, because I've learned that the first emotion is not always the real one. Anger arrives first because it's protective. It shields you from the deeper thing underneath. The deeper thing, when it arrived, was grief. Not grief for myself, exactly. Grief for the architecture of my childhood, which had just been revealed to be built on a different foundation than I'd understood. My parents' marriage, the cold parallel lives on separate floors of the Rockcliffe Park house, the shared finances without shared meals, the way they occupied the same space with the careful negotiated distance of people who had agreed on terms but not warmth, suddenly made a different kind of sense. And then I found the last document, a divorce application, filed in 1995. My parents' names at the top of the form, official and impersonal. I was 2 years old when they filed it. The application had been withdrawn the same month it was submitted. The withdrawal note contained 4 words: reconciliation achieved. I knew what those 4 words meant. I am an immigration lawyer. I know what those 4 words always mean in that context. Divorce before citizenship was finalized would trigger review, would raise questions about the original marriage's legitimacy, would put everything they'd built in jeopardy: the status, the security, the life they'd carefully constructed in this country. They'd stayed together not because they'd found love, but because leaving would cost them everything they'd come here for. And what had they done with the life they'd preserved through that calculated staying? They'd spent 30 years in it. They'd raised a child in it. Raised me in a house that ran on transaction and conditional investment, and the philosophy that you don't owe your children anything just because you had them. They'd built a social world and a community standing, and a Rockcliffe Park house and a retirement that looked, from the outside, exactly like the life of a family who'd done everything correctly. They had done exactly what they accused me of doing. I called my Uncle James that evening from the balcony, the canal black below me in the winter dark, David visible through the glass behind me, reading in the living room light. "Uncle James," I said, "tell me about Mom and Dad's marriage." He exhaled slowly, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. "I wondered when you'd ask," he said. "Your mother called me in a panic when she saw you going through old photos at Christmas that one year. You were maybe 12, you found some albums. She was afraid you'd ask questions. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because it wasn't my story to tell. And because—" He paused. "Because I kept hoping they'd tell you themselves. That eventually they'd want you to know them as real people, not just as the parents they performed." He told me everything then, his voice low and careful, a story assembled from 30 years of proximity. My parents had been colleagues at a research lab in Nigeria before emigrating, both chemists, both brilliant in their way, both navigating the same complicated calculus of getting out and getting established somewhere that would let them build the lives their education had promised them. The marriage had been practical, a partnership. My father needed to demonstrate family establishment for additional citizenship points. My mother needed to not be deported. "They weren't enemies," my uncle said. "I want you to understand that. They weren't cruel to each other. They were colleagues, in the truest sense. They respected each other's competence. They just never figured out how to be in love. And me?" A long pause. "You were meant to be the thing that made it real." I think they both believed, hoped, that having a child would convert the arrangement into something genuine, that you would be the proof, not just for immigration, but for themselves. "Did it work?" "Maya." His voice was very gentle. "Does it look like it worked?" I stood in the cold for a long time after we hung up. The Parliament buildings were visible in the distance, lit against the dark sky. The Peace Tower's clock face glowing. Ottawa at night, the city I was born in, the city I'd built my life in, beautiful and cold and full of its own complicated history. I thought about February 14th, David's appointment, the interview that was coming, and I thought about what information I now had in my possession and what I was going to do with it. Valentine's Day arrived the way Ottawa's February days often do, clear and savage and beautiful. The kind of cold that has a quality to it, a sharpness that is almost aesthetic. The sun bright enough to make you squint, the light bouncing off snow so that everything is twice as illuminated as it seems like it should be. I stood on the balcony at 7 in the morning with my coffee and watched the canal, and I felt something I can only describe as ready. Not calm. Exactly. Calm implies the absence of feeling, and I was full of feeling, but organized. The feelings had found their proper arrangement. David appeared behind me, already in his suit. He looked good. He'd bought it specifically for this, 2 weeks earlier, taking the process with the seriousness of someone who understood the weight of the occasion without making it feel heavy. "You should see your face," he said when he saw me looking at him. "What does my face look like?" "Like someone who has all the cards and is waiting for the other players to stop pretending they don't." We drove to the IRCC office on Laurier Avenue in near silence, the comfortable silence of two people who have talked everything through and arrived on the other side. Our folder was in the back seat, 2 inches thick. Every document a lawyer who has spent 6 years building legitimacy cases would think to include: both our birth certificates, my citizenship card, my Law Society of Ontario credentials, my employment letter on firm letterhead, 3 years of tax returns that told the story of my income clearly and without ambiguity, the deed to the condo, our marriage certificate, photographs spanning 3 years of actual shared life, letters from people who had watched us become a couple and then a partnership and then a family. We arrived at 9:30 for our 10:00 appointment. My parents arrived at 9:45. I saw them through the glass door before they saw me. My mother in her church coat, the good one, dark wool, which she wore when she needed to project respectability. My father with his hands in his pockets and his chin slightly raised, the posture he adopted when he was nervous and refused to show it. They pushed through the door and scanned the waiting area and found us and arranged their faces into something that was performing love. "We came to support you," my mother said. She moved to embrace me, and I let her. And over her shoulder I met David's eyes, and he gave me the smallest nod. He had one hand on my back, grounding me. "These interviews can be tricky. We thought you might need family here." "That was thoughtful," I said. My father shook David's hand with the brief, firm grip of a man performing regard he doesn't fully feel. "How are you holding up, son?" David said he was fine, thank you. And I watched my parents settle into the waiting area chairs, and I thought, you came because you're afraid of what I might say. You came to monitor, not to support. You came because if something goes wrong, if some question in that room touches something old and documented and inconvenient, you want to be here to redirect it before it finds its shape. At 10:00, an officer appeared at the door and called us in. We followed her down a corridor that smelled of institutional carpet and recycled air, the kind of hallway that exists in every government building, functional and identical and designed to make the architecture of authority feel permanent rather than constructed. David walked beside me, his folder under his arm, his stride unhurried. I watched him from the corner of my eye. He looked like a man who has nothing to worry about, which is different from looking like a man who is performing having nothing to worry about. The distinction is visible if you know what to look for. I'd interviewed enough people in my professional life to know the difference between genuine ease and its theater. David's was genuine. He had always been, in the years I'd known him, someone for whom honesty functioned as a kind of structural support. He wasn't brave in the dramatic sense. He was simply congruent. The person he was internally matched the person he presented externally, with a consistency I'd found almost disorienting when I first encountered it. Accustomed as I was to the gap between presentation and reality being the normal condition of human interaction. Behind us, in the waiting area through the glass partition, I could feel my parents settling into their chairs. I did not look back. The corridor turned, and we were at interview room 3. The officer, Christine Houle, according to the nameplate I'd registered immediately, gestured us in and closed the door. I noted the room the way I always note rooms I'm working in. Exits, sightlines, acoustics, the position of the glass partition, and what it meant for who could see and hear what from where. Old professional habit. The room was designed for exactly this purpose. Legitimacy interviews conducted in a space that was neutral but not comfortable, impersonal but not hostile. The overhead lighting had the particular quality that flattens affect and makes everyone look like they're being processed rather than listened to. I straightened in my chair. The folder was on the table in front of me, and I rested my hands on it. And I breathed through the 4 counts David and I had practiced. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted my nervous system to know it was allowed to settle. This was a moment I had been building toward for 2 years. The preparation was complete. The evidence was present. The truth was simply the truth, and I had always, in my professional experience, found truth to be the most stable surface to stand on. Officer Hoole looked up from the file, and we began. Interview room 3 was small and deliberately neutral. Government beige, a table, 3 chairs, the kind of institutional fluorescent lighting that makes everything look slightly more serious than it might otherwise be. The officer was a woman in her mid-50s with silver-threaded hair, cut practically short, and an expression trained to hold warmth in reserve until it was earned. Her nameplate, Christine Hoole. She was reviewing the file on her desk when we sat down, and she reviewed it for a moment without looking up, which I recognized as a technique. Let them settle. Let the room do some of the work. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, she said finally, using the hyphenated name from my performance documents. This interview is to verify the legitimacy of your marriage for permanent residence purposes. Please understand this is standard procedure and doesn't imply any suspicion on the part of IRCC. We understand, David said. His voice was even, warm, entirely composed. I knew without looking that he was sitting with his hands relaxed on the table, open posture, the body language of someone with nothing to hide because they have nothing to hide. Officer Hoole walked us through the standard sequence. She was good at her job, which I recognize professionally. She asked questions that seemed simple, but were actually designed to surface inconsistency if inconsistency existed, to find the gaps between memorized answers and genuine knowledge. Where did we meet? Toronto, an immigration law conference, spring of 2022. Which conference specifically? She raised an eyebrow at that. Not many officers drill down to specifics on that question. I gave her the full name, the venue, the date, the name of the panel I'd been speaking on. When did we begin dating? April. When did we marry? October 2023, Ottawa City Hall, small ceremony. Where do we currently live? I gave her the Bank Street address. There was a beat of silence. She noted it down. And can you tell me about your employment? I looked at David. He looked at me. This was the moment we had agreed on. The point where the performance ended and the truth began. And I remember feeling the particular quality of it, the way a deep breath feels before a very cold dive. Not fear, but resolution. The body preparing itself for what the mind has already decided. My husband is a software engineer, I said, my voice clear and entirely level, currently employed on a work permit. I am an immigration lawyer at Richter & Associates. I've been in practice for 6 years. My area of focus is corporate immigration, which is partly why we wanted to handle David's application carefully and correctly. My annual income is $190,000. I can provide employment verification, Law Society of Ontario credentials, tax returns, and anything else you need. Officer Hoole's pen stopped moving. The room changed. Not dramatically, she was too professional for dramatic reactions, but something shifted in the quality of her attention, a recalibration that was almost physical. I see, she said. She looked back at her file. I have you listed here as working part-time in food service. That information is incorrect. I've never worked in food service. Your application indicates you're a work permit holder, dependent on your husband's status. Also incorrect. I'm a Canadian citizen by birth. Ottawa General Hospital, January 15, 1997. I have never required immigration status of any kind. I was born here. I've practiced law here for 6 years. My husband's application is genuine. Our marriage is genuine. And I've been personally involved in managing his case because this is literally my professional expertise. From the waiting area behind the glass partition, which was designed for observation from both sides, I heard the breath go out of the room. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel them out there, my parents, the stillness that falls over people when the story they've been telling has just been publicly contradicted. David opened the folder. He laid the documents on Officer Hoole's desk in the order we'd agreed. My birth certificate first, then the citizenship card, the Law Society credentials with the Ontario Bar registration number clearly visible, the employment letter, 3 years of tax returns, the condo deed. Officer Hoole reviewed them with the thoroughness of someone whose entire understanding of a situation has just been replaced. I watched her face carefully. I am good at reading faces. It is part of what I do in courtrooms and conference rooms and exactly these kinds of interview rooms. And what I saw was not suspicion. It was the specific cognitive recalibration of a professional encountering a fact pattern that doesn't match the file. Ms. Okonkwo, she said. And I registered the correction, the shift from the hyphenated name to my actual name. I'm trying to understand why the application contains this information about your status. Who assisted in preparing this application? My husband submitted the primary application with my assistance, I said carefully. However, I'm aware that my parents offered to help with paperwork. I declined their assistance directly. I cannot speak to what they may have submitted through other channels if they believed they were being helpful. The pause that followed was very long. Officer Hoole's eyes moved past me to the glass partition, to the waiting area where my parents sat. Are those your parents in the waiting area? Yes. They came to support you today? That's what they said, yes. Officer Hoole stood. Please excuse me for a moment. We watched through the glass. She walked out with the measured pace of someone who knows exactly what she's doing and has decided to do it at exactly this speed. She approached my parents. My mother's hands went to her handbag, that reflexive gesture of a woman reaching for something to hold on to. My father's posture, already rigid, went more rigid still. Officer Hoole spoke. My mother spoke back, animated, her hands moving. My father shook his head once, then again. Officer Hoole returned to her desk. She sat. She opened her computer and typed something, waited, read what came back. Her expression, when she looked up, had changed. It is very hard to describe what I saw. Not hostility, not satisfaction. She was too professional for satisfaction. It was closer to the look of someone who has just found the piece that makes the puzzle coherent and is deciding what to do with the coherence. She looked at me directly. Ms. Okonkwo, are your parents Adewale and Blessing Okonkwo, Canadian citizens since 1994? My heart was very steady. Yes. And their citizenship was obtained through marriage-based permanent residence? Yes. I see. She turned back to her screen. She typed again. She read. She waited. And then she did something I had not anticipated, the thing that transformed the morning from confrontation into something else entirely. She turned her screen, not toward me, I couldn't read the details, but at an angle that made the header briefly visible. Okonkwo, Adewale and Blessing, citizenship application, 1994. What a small world, Officer Hoole said, and her voice was professionally neutral in a way that suggested considerable force being applied to keep it that way. I actually processed part of their legitimacy assessment years ago, when I was a junior officer. You see all kinds of things in this work, especially in the early days when you're still learning what to look for. She was speaking to me, but she had raised her voice very slightly. The glass partition was not soundproof. The standards were quite different back then, of course, she continued, making a small note in her file. Now we have much better systems for detecting fraudulent marriages, better analytical tools, better cross-referencing, much longer institutional memory. Back in the early 90s, if someone was pregnant at the time of application, we generally accepted the marriage as legitimate, even if the interview had raised certain questions, even if the couple seemed to barely know each other. In the waiting area, my mother rose to her feet. Officer Hoole did not look toward the partition. She was looking at me. These days, we're actually able to review old files when new circumstances bring them to our attention. Pattern analysis, family linkages. It's remarkable what 30 years of additional data allows us to identify. A pause. Sometimes patterns of fraudulent behavior carry forward through generations, and sometimes, ironically, the children of applicants who had irregularities in their original applications are the most scrupulously honest, because they've had a close view of what the alternative looks like. She smiled at me. It was a precise and considered smile. You are clearly in the latter category, counselor. David was approved. On the spot. Officer Hoole stamped the documentation, made her notes, and told us to expect formal confirmation of permanent residence processing within 6 weeks. She shook our hands. She thanked us for being so well prepared. We walked out of interview room 3 into the waiting area. There is a particular stillness in a room where something irrevocable has just become visible. I've seen it in courtrooms during verdicts. I've seen it in interview rooms when a document surfaces that changes the entire shape of a case. It is not the stillness of peace or resolution. It is the stillness of a system in the instant before it reorganizes itself around a new truth. That suspended moment when the old architecture is gone and the new one hasn't fully materialized. That was the quality of the waiting area when we walked into it. My parents sat in the row of chairs nearest the window, the February light falling across them at an angle that made them look older than they had when they'd walked in. My mother's handbag was on her lap, both hands holding it, her knuckles not quite white but close. My father's chin, which had been raised when he entered, was level now, the posture of a man recalibrating. The two officers stood with the practiced patience of people who wait for a living, whose entire professional skill set is about managing the moment between one reality and another. I stopped walking. I had planned for this moment. I had thought about it in careful, deliberate detail across many evenings and several sleepless hours at 2 a.m. when the thinking wouldn't stop. I had rehearsed, internally, the things I might say and the tone I would say them in. I had decided on measured. I had decided on clear. I had decided specifically that I would not perform anything, not anger, not grief, not triumph, because I was finished with performing. And this was the room where the performances ended. What I had not prepared for was how small they would look. My father, who had spent my entire childhood being large in the room, his opinions occupying more space than his body, his judgments setting the gravitational field everything else orbited, sat in the plastic government chair with his hands in his lap and looked like what he was. An aging man who had made a choice 30 years ago and had just learned that choices have a very long memory. My mother, who had built her community standing on the story of a daughter who had squandered her advantages, who had performed maternal suffering at the Hintonburg Community Center with the stagecraft of someone who had genuinely believed her own production. She looked, for the first time in my memory, uncertain. Not of what to say, of who to be. I let that settle. I didn't rush toward the confrontation. I let the moment have its full weight. My parents were still there, but they had been moved. 2 officers were with them now, one seated beside my mother with a tablet, one standing slightly to the side with the particular posture of someone whose job is to ensure no one leaves before the conversation is complete. I could see a file on the tablet from where I stood, though I couldn't make out the details. My father saw me. I have tried, since that day, to find the precise language for what I saw in his face. He is not a man who shows much, who has ever shown much. This has always been part of the difficulty, not knowing whether there was more underneath or whether the surface was all there was. But in that moment, for the first time in my 29 years, I saw fear in his face. A specific, deep, humiliating fear. Not fear of immigration consequences, though those were coming, I suspected. And they would be thorough and expensive and humiliating, if not criminally significant. A 30-year-old fraud is complicated territory, and I'd thought about this carefully in the weeks before. What I wanted was review, not destruction. I wanted the discomfort of scrutiny, not lives ruined. What I saw was something deeper than fear of consequence. What I saw was the fear of a man who has built 30 years of moral authority on a foundation that has just been excavated and found hollow. My father, who had kept a spreadsheet, who had told me I married a charity case, who had sat across from me at his dining room table and lectured me about strategic thinking and pragmatic choices and the importance of bringing value to a family. He had done everything he accused me of. He had done it before I existed. He had done it so thoroughly and so long ago that he'd apparently managed to forget, or perhaps simply to reclassify it in the mental ledger where he kept his self-assessment. David waited by the door, giving me space. I walked to my parents. I stood in front of them, and I waited until I had both their full attention. My mother, who had stopped crying or perhaps hadn't started yet. My father, who was very still in the way that only controlled panic looks still. And I said, The marriage you told immigration I entered for status purposes? It's real. The struggle you've been financially supporting for 2 years? Performance. The desperate daughter who needed your help? She never existed. My mother opened her mouth. I raised my hand, and she closed it. You lied to a country, I said. You used a pregnancy as proof of a genuine marriage. You stayed together just long enough to secure citizenship, then filed for divorce the moment you thought it was safe. You built your entire Canadian life on fraud. And then you had the audacity, the specific, spectacular audacity, to accuse me of the same thing. That was different, my mother started. How? The word landed in the silence between us and stayed there. Nobody said anything for a long moment. You saw your own fraud in me like a mirror, I said, and I let the weight of it be fully present in my voice. Let it carry everything I'd carried for 2 years of Sunday calls and spreadsheet dinners and community center humiliations. And instead of feeling guilt, you felt entitled to judge. My mother was crying now. The tears came in the specific way of someone caught, not someone grieving, fast, reactive, seeking the shortest path to being forgiven before consequences arrived. Once, this would have moved me. I am not made of stone. I am my parents' daughter, and I have their capacity for feeling, whatever they did with theirs. But I had done my grieving already. I'd done it on the balcony in the dark with the canal below me, and my uncle's voice in my ear telling me I was the insurance policy. I'd done it at my desk with the documents spread before me in the clear winter light. I had given myself that privately, on my own time, and I had come to this moment with it already processed. Which is different from not feeling it, which is different from being cold. The money you loaned me, I said. All $8,750 of it. I'm having my assistant transfer double that amount to your account this afternoon. $17,500. Consider it payment for the experiment. I needed 2 years and $17,500 to confirm that your love has always been conditional on my weakness. Maya, please, my father began, and his voice had something in it I'd never heard before. A smallness, a shrinkage. The voice of a man who has been very large in his own estimation for a very long time and has just been reduced to his actual dimensions. I'm not cutting you off, I said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not vindictive. Vindictive would be walking out that door and never speaking to you again, and I've thought about it carefully, and that's not what I want. What I want is for things to change, and for things to change, I have conditions. I pulled out my phone. I'd written the note weeks earlier on a Tuesday evening when David was at the gym, and I was sitting with a glass of wine and the strange, clarifying peace of someone who has finally decided on the form their future will take. I'd written it carefully. I'd revised it twice. I'd shown it to David and to my uncle, who both had thoughts, which I'd incorporated. First, you will attend family therapy. Not because I believe it will transform you into different people, I am a realist, but because I need you to hear from a professional outside this family what has been done here. Second, every dollar you loaned me gets reframed as a gift, retroactively. In your minds and in your words, you will retire the spreadsheet. There is no debt. There was never a debt. Third, you will apologize to David in writing for what you said about him, about our marriage, about his worth as a person. He is my husband and my partner, and he has done nothing to deserve your contempt. My mother was still crying. My father was very still. And fourth, I said, and this was the one that cost me something to say because it was the most honest of all of them, the one that admitted what was still there underneath the experiment and the evidence and the carefully organized grief. Fourth, you will stop presuming to know who I am. You don't know me. You have never tried to. You've known the version of me that was useful to your narrative. First, the ungrateful, successful daughter who needed no help, then the struggling daughter who validated your warnings about my choices. You have never been curious about me as a person. If you want to change that, if you want to actually know who I am, not who you needed me to be, the door is open, conditionally and slowly. Because trust is rebuilt in very small steps, and neither of us is starting from a strong position. Officer Houle appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision, 3 feet away, professional and patient. Mr. and Mrs. Okonkwo, We'll need you to come with us for some additional questions about your 1994 application. My father looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked away. My mother looked at me as she followed the officer, one backward glance when she was almost through the door, and her expression in that moment. I have thought about it often since, tried to classify it, tried to understand it. It might have been regret. It might have been fear. It might have been, for the first time in a long time, something like genuine seeing. I didn't know then. I'm not entirely sure I know now. David was beside me when we walked out into the February sunshine. Ottawa was luminous that day, the kind of winter beauty that almost hurts to look at, the Parliament buildings rising against a sky so blue it looked painted, the snow on the grounds caught in the low February light, so that it seemed to generate its own glow from underneath. The Rideau Canal was frozen solid, and from where we stood I could see the distant figures of skaters moving in long, easy arcs, and the steam of someone's coffee rising in the cold air. "Well," David said. "Well," I agreed. He put his arm around my shoulders. I felt the warmth of it cut through the cold. "You know they may not take the conditions." "I know. And you're genuinely okay with that?" I thought about the condo with its east-facing windows. I thought about 6 years of building something I was proud of. I thought about the $400 espresso machine I'd bought myself because I'd wanted it and could afford it and had never mentioned to anyone who would keep score. I thought about David's terrible art collection hung on our walls with complete, unapologetic sincerity. "I'm okay with knowing who they are," I said. Finally. Completely. Without any more questions. We walked home. Not to the Bank Street apartment. I'd have to tell the friend who'd lent it to me that we were done with the arrangement. And I was looking forward to having that conversation because it would be simple and clean and true. We walked home to our actual apartment, the one on the 8th floor with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the bad art and the books stacked too deep on shelves that were slightly too small for our collection. We walked home to our life. I ordered from the Thai place on Elgin Street that evening, the one we went to for celebrations, and I ordered far more than 2 people could eat because we could, and because I felt suddenly, inexplicably, like having abundance around me. David opened wine. We sat on the couch with the food spread on the coffee table, and the canal visible through the windows, dark and glittering with reflected city light. "Tell me something," I said. "What?" "Did you ever, even once, doubt that it was worth it? The 2 years?" He thought about it seriously, which is one of the things I love about him. He takes questions seriously. He doesn't default to reassurance. He actually considers. "There were moments," he said finally. "Sunday evenings sometimes, when you'd get off the phone with them and you had that look, like you'd been somewhere unpleasant for too long. Those moments I wondered if the information was worth the cost." "Was it?" "That's your question to answer, not mine." My phone rang while we were eating. "My mother," the screen said. I watched it ring. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. 20 minutes later, my father. Same. I didn't listen to the voicemails that night. I let them sit in the phone like letters I wasn't ready to open yet, which is what they essentially were. The text from my Uncle James came at 10:15, after I'd put the leftover food away and David was washing up, and I was standing at the east window in the dark watching the canal. "Heard about today? Your parents called me. I told them I didn't raise you, they did. Whatever you are now, that's their legacy. Good or bad. Proud of you, kiddo." I stood there for a long time with that message on the screen, and I thought about legacy. What people leave behind them. What they build in the people they raise, intentionally or not. My parents had set out to build something practical and had produced, accidentally, someone who understood the difference between performance and truth, between conditional and real, between a marriage of convenience and a marriage of genuine choice. They'd tried to build a chess player and had built instead a lawyer with full discovery of the board. There is a particular kind of love that exists between people who have been through something together. Not the easy, early love of compatible personalities finding each other. The love that has been through the test, that has sat in an immigration office and revealed itself and remained. David came and found me at the window, and we stood there together watching the canal. And he didn't say anything because he knew I wasn't thinking about things that needed words. And this uncanny ability to know the difference, is the love I chose. The love that costs nothing strategically and everything personally and has paid dividends in the form of a life I am genuinely proud of. In the months that followed, things resolved themselves into their proper shapes. My parents met with immigration officials 4 separate times for what turned out to be an extensive file review. No criminal charges were filed. The case was too old. The statute of limitations complicated, and the fact that they had remained married introduced ambiguity about intent that made prosecution unlikely. But the review process was everything I had imagined. Humiliating and thorough and expensive, requiring lawyers, producing documentation requests that reached back 3 decades, pulling people from their lives for meetings that went on for hours. My mother mentioned it to me once, in the 3rd month, at a lunch we were trying to have in a careful, therapeutic way, both of us in the early stages of learning who we actually were to each other. "All this trouble," she said, "because we tried to help you with your application." I set down my fork. I looked at her, and I said gently, because I had decided that gentle was the register I wanted to occupy. "No, Mom. All this trouble because you committed fraud 30 years ago and then projected it onto me. I was just the mirror. And you didn't like what you saw." She didn't bring it up again. Therapy happened eventually. Not quickly. And not gracefully. My father attended the first session as if appearing under protest, and the therapist noted in the gentlest possible clinical language that he was not yet ready to engage with the material. He got better at it. My mother arrived at the sessions defending herself initially, reframing, contextualizing. She got better at it too. We are not, I want to be honest about this, a transformed family. We are not the family from the sentimental version of this story, where revelation produces immediate understanding and love fills all the gaps that judgment had occupied. We are 4 people, 2 of whom are slowly, imperfectly, learning to be in each other's lives without the machinery of transaction and performance, holding the relationship together. Some months we have dinner. At restaurants I choose, we split the bill in half. They have never seen the condo. That boundary remains, and I've made peace with it. The condo is mine in a particular way that has nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with being built in the years when I was building myself, without help, without witness, without anyone to report to. Bringing my parents into it would change something about what it means. I'm not ready for that, and perhaps never will be. These are the honest shapes of the future I'm living into. David got his permanent residence. We're discussing citizenship now. He jokes, with the cheerful reasonableness of a man who means what he says, that he's in no rush. "I married you for love," he tells me. The status is just paperwork. He means it in the way that only people who have never needed status as a strategy can mean it, and I find this uncomplicated and good. I still practice immigration law. I am, I think, better at it than I was before the experiment. Not because I've learned more technically, but because I understand the emotional architecture differently. I know what it feels like to be seen as a document instead of a person. I know what it feels like to be the subject of scrutiny when you know you're telling the truth, and the question is whether the system will believe you. I've developed a reputation for legitimacy cases, for clients whose real marriages look suspicious on paper because the bureaucratic categories don't accommodate the actual shapes that real love takes. I know how to tell genuine from performed. I've practiced both from the inside. Officer Houle is still at the Laurier Avenue office, and I encounter her occasionally in my professional capacity. She maintains the perfect neutrality of someone who knows that the system works best when its officers are not personally involved. She nods when we pass in the hallway. That is all. Except once. After a particularly difficult case, a client whose marriage was real in every way that mattered and had spent 18 months being disbelieved, I won a review that reversed the original determination, and I was in the hallway after, gathering my papers, feeling the particular tiredness of a hard thing done well, when Officer Houle appeared. "You did good work in there, counselor," she said. "Thank you." She paused and something shifted in her expression. Just slightly, the professional neutrality giving way for a moment to something warmer and more specific. "And on Valentine's Day last year," she said quietly. "That was good work too. Teaching moments matter in this field, on both sides of the desk." She walked away before I could respond. I drove home that evening and told David the story. He was making dinner. He has become an enthusiastic, if technically inconsistent, cook, which produces meals that are either excellent or adventurous, never predictable. And he stopped what he was doing and listened. And when I finished, he laughed. The real laugh that comes from the genuine place. "You know what I love about you?" he said. "You're the only person I know who would spend 2 years and $17,500 to prove a point about conditional love." "Was it worth it?" I asked. "Ask me in 30 years, he said, "when we're actually old and we've been married longer than we've been alive. But from where I'm standing, yeah, you needed to know. And now you do." I thought about that in the weeks that followed. I still think about it. The knowing. There is a particular freedom in certainty, even when the thing you're certain about is painful. The uncertainty, the not knowing whether the love was real, whether the relationship was capable of transformation, whether the people who raised you were capable of the thing you needed from them, is its own kind of suffering. Continuous, low-grade, impossible to resolve through logic alone because the question isn't logical. It's emotional. It lives in the body, in the catch of hope every time the phone rings, in the way you still scan their faces when you enter a room looking for something that might tell you you were wrong to doubt. I don't scan anymore. I know what I'm walking into. I know what they can offer and what they can't, what they're working on and what is probably fixed by now into its final shape. I know the difference between my parents performing love because I need them, and my parents making imperfect, genuine effort because they're slowly learning who I actually am. I know the difference between a marriage built on paperwork and a marriage built on knowing someone completely. I know who my real family is. My uncle who always told me the truth. My husband who held my hand through 2 years of elaborate social experiment and loved me for the experiment rather than in spite of it. The immigration officer who pulled a file with bureaucratic precision and delivered the most ironic justice I have ever witnessed in a professional setting. The version of myself I built painstakingly in the years when I was doing it entirely alone and discovering that alone was enough, that I was enough, that the worst thing my parents' philosophy had accidentally given me was self-sufficiency I might never have developed if they'd been the parents I needed them to be. I woke this particular morning, late winter, the city beginning to hint at spring in the way Ottawa hints at spring, cautiously, briefly, taking it back if you seem too hopeful, and made coffee in my espresso machine and stood at the east window watching the canal. The ice is thinning. In a few weeks, it'll be water again, moving, carrying the light differently. Things end and become other things. David found me at the window, as he often does because he knows this is where I go to think. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about it the way I always think about real questions. Seriously, completely, without the shortcut of the reassuring answer. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I had to build a laboratory out of my own family, had to turn Sunday calls into data collection, had to transform the simple human longing for parental love into an experiment with hypothesis and methodology and documented results. I regret that the test was necessary because the alternative, never knowing, living in perpetual performance of hope, would have been worse. The truth itself, the clarity, the life I'm standing in this apartment, with this man, with this career and this city and this particular morning light? No regrets. Not even close. Here is what I know about the kind of love my parents offered, and the kind that actually sustains a life. Conditional love is not love with conditions. Conditional love is a different thing entirely. It is a transaction that borrows love's vocabulary, the words, the gestures, the surface effect, without its actual substance. It asks, "What can you give me? How do you make me look? What is your utility to my life and my narrative and my self-image?" And when the answer changes, the feeling changes with it. Real love asks different questions. It asks, "Who are you?" underneath the performance. What do you need that you haven't told me yet? How do I hold you through the versions of yourself that are still becoming? I spent 27 years trying to earn the first kind, not understanding that earning was the wrong framework entirely, that love you have to earn through success or need or strategic usefulness is not the thing you're longing for. It has the shape of it. It fills the space temporarily, but it doesn't hold. My parents spent 30 years in a marriage built on similar scaffolding and never quite figured out how to convert it to something load-bearing. I think sometimes that they know this, that the bitterness that calcified in that house over the decades came partly from the grief of it, the recognition, buried too deep to be spoken, that they had built something that looked right from the outside and felt hollow from within. They built it with me as their proof. And I walked into an immigration office at 29 years old and used their own methodology against them, and Officer Christine Houle pulled a 30-year-old file, and the mirror I'd held up to my family reflected not just what they'd done to me, but what they'd done to themselves, to each other, to the life they might have built if they'd started it in truth instead of convenience. The best revenge isn't cruelty. It was never cruelty. Cruelty would have been walking away, filing reports, maximizing the legal consequences, letting the full weight of 30-year-old fraud fall on people I still, in the complicated, honest way of someone who has done the grief work, love. The revenge, if it deserves the word, which I'm not sure it does, was living so completely and genuinely and without apology that the performance became impossible to maintain. The revenge was being so entirely myself in that interview room on Valentine's Day that the fiction they'd constructed around me simply could not stand up in the same space as the truth. The revenge was never having needed them at all, and finding out, and being okay. I finished my coffee. The canal was starting to catch the morning light. My phone had a text from my uncle, because my uncle is someone who texts on Tuesday mornings for no particular reason when he's thinking about you, which is the kind of family member I didn't know I had until I stopped performing for the family members who showed me spreadsheets. Thinking of you two? How's that terrible art collection coming along? I sent back a photograph of the newest edition David had brought home last week, a seascape in improbable colors, purchased from an estate sale in the Glebe for $30, which David had described as emotionally honest if technically limited. The love that makes space for a terrible seascape. The love that doesn't keep score. Now I do. And that knowledge, uncomfortable, clarifying, purchased at the cost of 2 years of Sunday calls and a theatrical Tim Hortons uniform and $17,500 transferred before noon on a Valentine's Day, is worth more than any inheritance they could have left me. Worth more than any approval I might have spent my life trying to earn. I know who my parents are. I know who I am. I know, finally and completely, the difference. And the best life I can live is not the one that proves something to anyone. It's the one I'm already living. The truth is that most of us spend years, sometimes our entire lives, performing for an audience that hasn't earned the show. We make ourselves smaller, needier, more palatable, more useful, more strategically positioned in someone else's narrative, trying to activate a love that either exists or doesn't, that cannot be summoned by becoming whoever the person needs you to be. Research on attachment and relational patterns consistently shows that children raised in transactional family systems, where love and resources are contingent on performance, often spend decades in adulthood unconsciously recreating the conditions they grew up in, either trying to finally earn the approval they missed, or protecting themselves so thoroughly from the possibility of rejection that genuine connection becomes impossible. Maya's experiment was unusual in its deliberateness, but the underlying drive is universal. The need to know who people are when they believe they have power over you. To find out, once and for all, whether the love is there or whether the space where love should be has been filled with something that only resembles it at a distance. If you recognize something of yourself in this story, if you've spent years performing for people who kept the score differently than you understood, know that the experiment Maya ran is available to you without the elaborate machinery. The truth always surfaces. The mirror always arrives. And the freedom that comes from finally knowing, even when the knowledge is painful, is worth the cost of finding out. If this story hit close to home, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who might need to hear it. And drop a comment. Have you ever had to test someone to find out who they really were? What did you learn? I read every single one. If you're not subscribed yet, consider this your sign. We have new stories every week that go to these same places, the complicated, honest, sometimes devastating places where family and truth and identity intersect. And I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? What time is it there? Tell me in the comments. There is something I love about knowing that this story is reaching someone in a different time zone, maybe a different season, maybe a morning like this one, or a late night when you needed exactly this. The video on your screen right now is one I think you need to see next. It is the story of a woman who gave 30 years of her life to a marriage everyone around her called perfect, until the day she found one piece of paper that unraveled everything. The comments on that one are unlike anything I've ever read. People are still talking about it. Don't sleep on it, don't let it sit there. Click it now.